My daughter said something to me last November that I haven't been able to put down. 7 words, said quietly across a kitchen table. No anger in them, no accusation, just the flat, plain truth of someone who had been carrying something a long time and finally decided to set it down. I'm 74 years old. My name is Ray, and those 7 words took apart 50 years of certainty in about 30 seconds. I'm not going to tell you what she said yet, not because I'm trying to be clever about it, but because if I tell you now, you won't understand why it hit the way it did, and I want you to understand that. I need to take you back first. There's a version of my life that looks, from any reasonable angle, like a success. Long career, steady income, respected in the town where I lived. My name was on a plaque outside a county building for a while. People shook my hand with both of theirs. My father, the year I got my first real job, looked at me across the dinner table and said, with a steadiness I still remember, "You did it." He was not a man who said things like that easily. That moment settled into my chest like something clicking into place, and I carried that feeling for the next 50 years. I just didn't understand what I was carrying it for. What I thought I was doing, and I believed this as completely as I have ever believed anything, was building a good life. What I was actually doing was building something that looked like one. Those are not the same thing. I understood that only after my daughter looked at me across a table and told me the truth about what it had been like to grow up with me as her father. I'll get there, but first I need you to understand what I believed for 50 years was evidence that things were going well. I grew up in a house in western Pennsylvania where doing well meant getting out and getting steady. My father worked a mill job for 31 years. Good man, quiet man, but the message was clear. The measure of a life was stability and standing. What people thought of you, whether the neighbors knew your name for the right reasons. I absorbed that the way you absorb temperature, not as a lesson, just as the weather. So when I got hired at 26 as a junior engineer at a firm in Pittsburgh, and my father shook my hand at the table, and my wife Diane squeezed my arm. Diane was 24. We'd been married 2 years. She had that look she got when she was trying not to cry. I thought, this is what it feels like to be on the right path. And I filed it away. The feeling of being recognized as someone who was doing it right. That was 1977. I didn't understand until last November that I spent the next 46 years chasing variations of that feeling. Not money exactly. Not power in the obvious way. What I wanted was a particular kind of weight when people said my name. The kind where a client at lunch would lean across the table and say, "I specifically asked for you on this project." The kind where a department head would stop me in a hallway, hand on my arm, and say, "Your name came up in the meeting this morning," and the way he said it told me everything I needed to know. The kind where a performance review used the word exceptional, and I read that word 3 times in the car before I went inside for dinner. I collected those moments, one at a time, for decades. By 35, I was a senior manager. By 42, I was running my own division. By 48, my name was in a press release, and there was a photograph in the local paper. Me in a hard hat, shaking hands with a county official, a building going up behind us. Diane framed it and hung it in the hallway without my asking. I walked past that frame almost every day for 20 years. Diane noticed something before I did. Around the time I turned 43, she said, and she was calm about it. That was just her way. She said, "Ray, I think the most important room you're ever in is the one where someone important might be watching you." I heard her. I nodded. And then I explained, at some length, the particular pressures of a job at that level, and I went back to work. I had a system for things like that, true things that were uncomfortable. They went into a mental drawer, and the drawer closed, and the next morning I drove to the office, and someone needed my opinion on something, and the drawer stayed shut. Things Diane said went in there. Things my daughter Lauren said as a teenager went in there. That specific hollow feeling I got sometimes on Sunday evenings, the one I could never quite locate or name, that went in there too. One decent piece of praise from someone above me in the building, and I didn't think about the drawer again for months. Lauren was born in 1979, her brother Tim 2 years after. I was there for the things a father is supposed to be there for: birthdays, graduations, the important weekends. But there is being there, and there is being present, and I understand now that those are two entirely different things wearing the same name. There was a spring afternoon. Lauren must have been 9 or 10 when she was in the backyard trying to learn to ride a bike without training wheels. Diane came to the back door and said, "Ray, come watch." And I said, "In a minute," because I was on the phone with a client in Philadelphia, something about revised drawings that needed to be sent by 4 o'clock. By the time I got off the call, Diane was in the kitchen making dinner, and Lauren was inside too, quiet, and the bike was leaning against the fence. I never asked how it went. I don't think I thought to. Saturday morning she would come downstairs, and I would already be at my desk. This was years before anyone worked from home. I had just made an office of the corner of the living room, and she'd stop in the doorway. I'd say, "Give me 10 minutes," and sometimes that was true, and sometimes it wasn't. There were dinners where I was physically at the table and mentally 3 floors up in an office building, composing the next thing I needed to say. There were evenings Diane wanted to talk, and I had already spent the best of myself somewhere I was being evaluated, and by the time I came home, there was nothing left with any real weight to it. Lauren stopped stopping in the doorway. I told myself it was just the age. That was just what daughters did when they became teenagers. I was right about what happened, and completely wrong about why. The years ran. They always do. I retired at 69, which felt later than I planned and earlier than I expected. The job ended, and what I found on the other side of it was quieter than I had anticipated. Diane died in the spring of my 2nd year of retirement, 18 months before last November. And last November I drove 4 hours north to stay with Lauren and her family for a few days. Her husband, their 2 kids. I had been making more of an effort since Diane. I knew I needed to. I understood that much. The second morning, her husband had gone to work. The kids were at school. Lauren was making coffee, and I was at her kitchen table, and it was just the 2 of us in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I remember thinking, this is what I needed, just this. She set the coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. And she looked at me with this particular expression. Careful is the right word. Not cold, not distant, just careful. The way you look at someone when you've been deciding whether to say something for a very long time. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. The kids, the drive, how I'd been sleeping. And then there was a pause that was different from the other pauses. She looked at her hands. She said, "I never really knew what you were thinking." 7 words. I assumed she meant since Diane. Grief changes people's interiors in ways that are hard to see from the outside, and I thought she was being gentle about my distance in the past year and a half. I started to say something along those lines. She shook her head, just slightly. She said, "No, I mean growing up. I always felt like the most important part of you was somewhere else." I didn't say anything. I sat there with the coffee warm in my hands, and I looked at my daughter, and I did not say anything for what must have been half a minute. The most important part of you was somewhere else. She was not being cruel. That is not who she is. She was saying something she had carried for a long time, and the hurt of it had softened enough that she could finally just say it plainly, the way you say a fact. What I felt was not exactly guilt. Guilt has urgency. It wants you to do something. What I felt was something much larger than guilt, something that had apparently been compressed for years, finally allowed to expand to its actual size. Like I had been holding something down without knowing I was holding it, and I had just let go. Because she was right. The most important part of me had, in fact, been somewhere else for the better part of 30 years. In the office, or on the way to it, or inside a presentation I was building, or sitting with the aftertaste of something that had gone well or badly in a room where people with authority were watching. I ran a closed loop. I went where I was evaluated. I performed well. I collected the confirmation that I was doing it right. I brought that confirmation home where it dissolved into the background, and then I went back to where I was evaluated. My daughter was 20 feet away for her entire childhood. The most awake I ever felt was when someone who mattered professionally was in the room. That is an unpleasant sentence to have to write about yourself. I have had a year with it, and it has not gotten less unpleasant. What I keep returning to is this. The instruments I was using were not broken. They worked exactly as they were supposed to work. A performance review, a professional reputation, a photograph in a local newspaper. These things measure what they measure. They told me, accurately, how I appeared from a particular angle. What I did for 50 years was mistake that reading for something it was not. I told myself the admiration was evidence of a life built correctly, evidence that the people who mattered, and without quite realizing it, I had sorted the world into people whose opinions mattered and people whose opinions were just warmth, just background, that those people confirmed I was doing it right. The terrible thing, if I'm being fully honest, is that they did confirm it. The confirmation was real. I earned it. It just couldn't tell me anything about what was happening in the rooms where no one was keeping score. Appearing well and living well look identical from the outside. I've been in the spare room twice since I got home from Lauren's. There's a box in there. The framed newspaper photograph is in it. It came down when we repainted the hallway 6 years ago and never went back up. I know exactly where in the box it is. I haven't taken it out. I think about Diane when I sit at the kitchen table in the mornings. I think about how many times she said something true and I put it in the drawer. She was not a complicated person to know. She was unusually clear about what she felt and what she needed. But she was not part of the measurement I was running. She had no title, no evaluation form, no professional authority over anything I cared about advancing. Her opinion of me registered as warmth, as comfort, as the settled background of my life, not as something I needed to earn, not as something I had any reason to attend to. I never once asked her, as a genuine question, "What do you think I'm actually like?" Not in 41 years. I would give almost anything to be able to ask her that now. Lauren and I talk more. She came down in January. We sat together in a way we hadn't in years. I'm not setting that aside. It matters. But she grew up in a house where her father's best self was perpetually in transit to somewhere he was being watched. The years she grew up in don't renegotiate themselves. What she experienced is what she experienced. My name is still on that plaque outside the county building. I drove past it last spring, felt almost nothing. Not because what I built wasn't real, it was. But I understand now that what I was really building was a case, evidence, proof presented to anyone who would look that I was the right kind of person. What I wasn't building was any real knowledge of whether that was true.